breaths she takes.
Rachel was living in terror.
What kind of calls was she getting? They were distorted voices saying that they were watching her.
You just don't get it. You see us all the time.
Every move she makes.
Why is he slashing my tires?
Someone is always watching. If ever there was a time to run away, this would be it. A woman pushed to the brink by a stalker moving in for the kill. Who will survive this deadly game of cat and mouse before it's game over? My name is Aphrodite Jones. As a true crime author, I take on controversial cases. I track down the story behind the story, and I won't stop until I get the truth. 1 in 6 women in America has been stalked. That's a staggering number for an insidious crime that sometimes can have deadly consequences. I have come to Moscow, Idaho, where a woman trapped in a stalker's sights was last seen. 35 miles from Moscow sits the small town of Clarkston, Washington. Here, in the winter of 2010, 40-year-old Rachel Anderson is a single mom, holding down 2 jobs while raising her 2 young sons. She also has 2 adult daughters, Amber and Ashley, who live nearby.
All right, I'll be waiting here. Don't make me hot chocolate, girls.
Life hasn't always been easy for Rachel. She's just separated from her most recent husband, but Rachel moves ahead with optimism rather than look back with regret.
She always saw the good in people. She never judged anybody on what they wore, what they drove, what their job was. She just took you for who you were and loved you.
But that positive attitude is about to be tested big time. It all begins in February 2010, when she starts receiving disturbing voice messages like this one.
So, we've tried to explain things. You just don't get it. You never apologize. You see us all the time.
And in the days and weeks that follow, the voice messages, texts, and calls become more frightening and more personal. What kind of calls was she getting?
They were not threatening outright in that the person was threatening to do her harm, but they were eerie, they were spooky, they were distorted voices saying that they were watching her.
The calls come from a variety of numbers Rachel doesn't recognize.
I want you to know, I don't owe you anything.
Why are you doing this to me? Who are you?
She returns the calls.
Yes, my name is Rachel Anderson. I've been receiving calls from this number.
Yet none of the people Rachel speaks with has any idea what she's talking about. After a couple of weeks of nonstop calls and messages to both her home and cell phones, Rachel alerts police and her family. But nobody can figure out how to stop the harassment.
Every time the phone rings, it's like I jump 10 feet into the air.
It's so surreal to have your sister call you, telling me she's sleeping in her living room with her lights on. She kept changing her number.
She changed her number a few times?
Yes, we kept telling her that had to have been somebody that knows her closely because they keep getting her phone number.
How could it be that no matter how many times Rachel changes her phone number, her stalker always seems to get it? What's more, the caller is clearly watching Rachel, timing his calls perfectly.
They knew she'd been out, or they saw her bathroom light turn on or turn off.
When Rachel's daughter Ashley hears about it, she immediately offers to come and stay with her mother.
She didn't want me to because she didn't want me to be put in that position. She was afraid that she was, to get someone else hurt. Don't worry about it. I will handle this.
It's March 14th, 2010. Rachel's on the phone with her sister when she sees someone outside approaching her car.
Wait. I'm on a bike slowing down. Why is he slashing my tires?
You were actually on the phone when that happened?
Yeah.
Rachel calls 911, but the vandal has disappeared into the night. Police have nothing to go on. In an effort to distract herself from the stalking, Rachel throws everything into her work. One of her employers is her ex-husband, Dennis Plunkett, who renovates and flips houses. Although they divorced in 2007, after a 5-year marriage, they remained good friends. But while she's at work, less than 2 weeks after her tires were slashed, her stalker apparently strikes again.
Her back window, someone broke it when she was parked at work.
Wait a minute, her window got broken from her car?
Yep.
On April 13th, 2010, a little more than 2 months after the stalking began, Rachel goes to the Asotin County Sheriff's Office to meet with Captain Dan Halley.
I'm very, very happy that you came in.
I built a relationship of trust relatively quickly with Rachel.
Why don't you start by going back to the beginning and tell me exactly what's been going on?
It started off very subtly, and it's just escalated, and this has just consumed my life, and I had to get this to stop.
It was very clear to me that Rachel was living in terror. She described how she had now borrowed a gun. She described how she wasn't sleeping. She described just this obsession with identifying who her stalker was.
It has to be somebody I know.
Rachel tells the captain she suspects a former boyfriend named William, who she hasn't dated in 2 years, but who recently contacted her. She also mentions her estranged husband, Charles Capone, who she separated from at the beginning of the year. The two first met in 2009.
You look like you're a pretty good pool player.
What makes you think so?
Prove me wrong.
My mom was all excited, and she's like, yeah, we had so much fun.
Still, to family and friends, the romance moves too quickly, especially when Rachel and Charles get married after only 6 months.
Describe it as a happy marriage.
Maybe we didn't know each other as well as I thought.
Can't believe you're sleeping in your shop.
Then, only 3 months into the marriage, Charles and Rachel separate, and Charles moves in with his buddy, Bert Bogdan.
He was always very respectful of her and had good things to say about her.
You think you and Rachel will get back together again?
Rachel's a good person. I told you that already.
Just as she is with her former husband, Dennis Plunkett, Rachel remains friendly with Charles as they consider whether to reconcile.
When can I see you?
The car's making that noise again.
Bring it by the shop. Probably just needs a tune-up.
Okay. Shoot. I gotta get the boys. It's late. I'll talk to you later.
What does Charles think about this stalker?
Charles has been supportive. He's been very supportive.
You know, you can always come to me.
That's why I'm here. There's just so much.
You're not alone here. I hate to admit this, but I can relate to what you're going through.
How would you know what I'm going through?
Because it's been happening to me, too.
What Charles says shocks Rachel.
You have any idea whose number that is?
He showed her where he had received calls.
He was able to show her on his phone?
Sure, yeah.
He was getting calls from a strange number?
He was being harassed. He was a victim too.
What do you think it could be?
I don't know, but I have some ideas.
Charles tells Rachel he's convinced her ex-boyfriend William is the culprit.
Now she was partnering with Charles to catch the person that was actually stalking her.
Look, you're the high-tech genius here. You have to know how this guy's getting away with this.
At the time, I was handling all the network security at my business, and so I was up on a lot of the details about how things work. He was enthusiastic about like catching this guy, nailing him. Let's go get him.
Rachel, there's one thing I want you to do immediately. I want you to make a list.
Captain Halley asked Rachel to come back in a few days with all the voicemails from the stalker. And in the meantime, more police will start patrolling her neighborhood.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Captain.
It's now 4 days after Rachel's meeting with Captain Halley. and Rachel's daughters are worried sick about their mom.
Hey, when's the last time you heard from Mom? Not since Thursday. That's like 2 days ago. I said I've been calling her all day and I can't get her to answer.
Mom, it's Amber again. Ashley and I really need to speak with you. Can you please call me back?
Coming up,
My niece called and told me that they hadn't heard from her, and she had just said, help, Mom's missing. And I said, oh my God.
your mom is missing. What state of mind are you in at this point? For nearly 3 months, 40-year-old Rachel Anderson has been terrorized by a stalker in the small town of Clarkston, Washington.
I want you to know, I don't owe you anything.
Why are you doing this to me? Who are you? Why are you doing this?
On April 19, 2010, Rachel is scheduled for a follow-up meeting with police to discuss the stalking. But she doesn't show up. She also never arrives at work. Let's face it, if ever there was a time to run away, this would be it. She's being stalked to the point that she can't live a normal existence. Your mom is missing. What state of mind are you in at this point?
I'm in a panic.
My niece called and told me that they hadn't heard from her, and she had just said, help, Mom's missing. And I said, oh my God, and we decided we were leaving that night.
So you drove for 14 hours?
14 hours, all night long.
Immediately when Rachel goes missing, her family takes action. They're driving in from South Dakota. No grass is growing under their feet. They are going to find her.
It's not like her to go missing. She would never take off from her kids.
The family wanted us to find out what happened. They wanted answers. And they just dropped everything, and they came here.
I want to be sure we check the highway. She could have driven off into a ravine somewhere.
Detective Jackie Nichols joins the investigation.
Jackie is really the right person because she's a pit bull on a pork chop. She really digs, and she doesn't give up.
She had 4 kids, I have 4 kids. There were some commonalities there. She was a member of our community. She raised her family here. Her kids went to school here. It just was a case that sort of touched everybody at the heart.
Detective Nichols meets with Rachel's sister and her daughters at Rachel's house.
We waited for the police department to get there because we were afraid we were going to find her dead.
Rachel's car is gone and her purse is missing, but nothing inside her house appears out of the ordinary.
So does anything look out of place here? No, it looks pretty normal. Yeah, my sister isn't the greatest housekeeper. She left her curling iron. It looks like she's coming back.
You're at the house, and you notice that she has her curling iron and it's plugged in.
Yeah, all of her stuff was still there that she would take if she was going somewhere.
So where is Rachel Anderson?
On the side of the road, if there was a bag, we'd go tear it open. It was just hold my breath and just hope that, she wasn't in there.
In the meantime, police approach Rachel's ex-boyfriend, William, to see if he knows anything about her disappearance. They learn that, despite his efforts to make contact, he hasn't seen Rachel in more than a year.
He denied having any involvement. He appeared to be somewhat dumbfounded or confused of why anybody would even believe that he was involved.
But on the heels of eliminating William as a suspect, police receive an unusual lead about Rachel's ex-husband and boss, Dennis Plunkett. They discover that Dennis was one of the last people Rachel called on April 16th, the night she disappeared.
Hey, it's Rachel.
What's more, one of Dennis's tenants claims that in the past, he's made some curious remarks about law enforcement.
The lady had become suspicious because Dennis had made a comment about if law enforcement ever shows up here, don't let him in without a search warrant.
So, Mr. Plunkett, what can you tell me?
But in this case, Captain Halley doesn't need a warrant. Dennis had told him he had nothing to hide.
Done yet?
Yeah.
She believes some concrete had recently been poured in the basement.
Captain Halley finds no sign of fresh concrete or foul play.
It doesn't look like it's been disturbed at all to me.
So Dennis Plunkett is also ruled out as a person of interest in Rachel's disappearance.
Dennis would never hurt my sister. He loves her and her kids very much.
So you didn't have any question in your mind?
No way.
Next, Hallie turns to Rachel's estranged husband, Charles Capone. He learns that just before she vanished, Rachel was seen here at Charles's garage in Moscow, Idaho, about 35 miles from Clarkston.
Mr. Capone. Dan Hallie. All right.
Yes,
Nice to
I've
meet
heard of you.
Wanted to see if you had a few minutes to answer a few questions.
Sure, come on in.
Thank you.
Charles says Rachel stopped by on the 16th while he was working on her car, but she never returned to pick it up.
I was wondering what happened to Rachel's car.
Well, here it is. It took a little bit longer than Rachel would have liked.
While he was repairing her car, Charles says he lent Rachel his friend Bert Bogdan's Yukon SUV.
Any idea what happened to the Yukon?
No. Wish I knew. I'm going to give Bert back his car.
Might you have an idea where we could find Rachel?
No.
He would just pause and say he needed time to compose himself. He had mentioned maybe she ran off. He made some mention about maybe she had a new person in her life.
Charles, did she mention anything to you about being stalked?
Stalking?
Yeah, stalking. You know anything about that?
I was the one doing that.
Coming up,
In retrospect, he was pumping me for information about how to stalk Rachel.
She was doing it to me, I was doing it to her.
he wants us to believe this was a game? Like they were playing checkers with each other? April 20th, 2010. 4 days after she was last seen, Rachel Anderson's estranged husband, Charles Capone, makes a startling confession to Captain Dan Hallie.
Did she mention anything to you about being stalked?
I was the one doing that.
Captain Hallie says Capone admits he's been stalking Rachel for the past 3 months.
You owe that one boyfriend you had an apology, but you never will.
He knew we were going to suspect him, so he readily admitted that.
She was doing it to me, I was doing it to her.
What was this, some type of game you were playing with her or something?
Yeah.
He characterized it as a tit-for-tat between spouses who were separated, who were having relationship troubles. He tried to say that she was doing the same thing to him, and we really could never substantiate that.
He wants us to believe this was a game? Like they were playing checkers with each other?
I know what you're doing, Rachel.
And I want you to know, I don't owe you anything.
As you can hear on this call, Capone had managed to mask his identity with an app on his smartphone.
You can disguise your cell phone number. You can also disguise your voice. You can make it sound like a male voice, female voice, older voice, younger voice.
Capone then convinced Rachel he was also being stalked.
You have any idea whose number that is? Maybe your ex-boyfriend?
Capone used several disposable track phones to call himself.
So he could show her on his phone that he had received a call from a number that he didn't know.
He then used the same app that disguised his voice to create the fake phone numbers. So while it appeared someone else was calling Rachel, the calls were actually coming from his phone. So all these threats, all these texts, all this bizarre behavior can all be traced to one phone number?
How's that guy getting away with this?
Used to be. You could do something as simple as calling somebody.
And as Capone was terrorizing Rachel, he was simultaneously deceiving his buddy, Bert Bogdan.
I could send you a message, you would have no idea where it came from.
In retrospect, he was pumping me for information about how to stalk Rachel.
So the reason he went to Bogdan in the first place is because what he's actually doing is trying to figure out how not to get caught.
See what I've done there?
The stalking allowed him to control Rachel, and that's what he wanted. He wanted her back.
That's great. You know, Charles, I got a couple other things to write down. You mind if I come back there?
As Captain Hallie concludes his initial questioning of Capone, he knows that getting him to confess to stalking Rachel is one thing, but getting him to admit he had something to do with her disappearance is quite another.
We had an individual that never once asked me about the course of the investigation if we had found any sign of his wife. He tells me he knows what happened.
All right, you know what?
And as the days pass, Rachel's sister Christina grows more and more suspicious of her estranged brother-in-law.
I had called Charles on the 19th and I said, why are you not handing out flyers? And he said, you know, he's working, he had some things he had to clear up, and he had to do this, he had to do that.
Your sister's not missing. She's with some other guy.
What? No. And he said she ran off with some guy named Vince. And I said, there is no guy named Vince. What are you talking about?
Was there a boyfriend that she had at the time?
No, absolutely not.
Capone's wild allegations only validate Christina's opinion of him, going back to when they met in 2009. Why didn't you like him?
We all thought right away, a lot of our family, he's very manipulative and very, portrays himself to be something he's not, and you can tell.
Rachel's daughter Ashley came to the same conclusion when she first went to Capone's apartment with her mom.
It's a very valuable antique that I own.
I didn't believe half the stuff that came out of his mouth. He had a poster in his apartment. We went to his house.
You know who that is?
Al Capone. He's like, yeah, I'm related to him.
Charles would tell people that he was a direct descendant of Al Capone. Through the course of the investigation, and just out of curiosity, I could find absolutely no link to Charles Capone and Al Capone. But I think he used that as a way to almost mesmerize people.
As I looked into Capone's disturbing past, I learned that Rachel had unknowingly gotten herself involved with a felon convicted of burglary, bank larceny, and aggravated assault.
I've known of Charles Capone for well before this case started because our office prosecuted him for threatening a former wife. He went into the bedroom while she was sleeping, he had the knife, and he was debating whether or not to kill her. And that was a pretty scary situation, understandably. To this day, she is petrified of him.
Capone's violent behavior towards women continued in 2009 when he choked his new wife, Rachel, during an argument. Rachel filed an incident report and they separated immediately after that, but no charges were ever filed. After delving into Capone's past, Captain Halley is convinced Capone is his prime suspect. He returns to Capone's garage several hours after his first visit. He's after a confession, and accompanied by Detective Nichols, may just have come up with a clever way to get it.
That was the first time Charles had seen Detective Nichols. And Detective Nichols looks similar to Rachel. And that, in this entire case, is the only time I've seen emotion out of Charles Capone. He looked upset, almost as if he was going to cry.
What are you expecting to find here? What do you want from me? I need you two to leave. I need you to get out.
At that point, that's where any cooperation on the part of Charles Capone ended.
Police set up surveillance on Capone, hoping he'll lead them to Rachel.
Some mechanics, they don't care if this shop is filthy.
Instead, on April 21st, 5 days after Rachel was last seen,
Hey! Want to get in other people's business, do you?
they're about to discover someone who will break this investigation wide open. Coming up.
They said, today, Charles, you're going to tell me that you murdered Rachel Anderson and where her body is.
You got one of those things right.
So he's admitting that he either knows where Rachel's body is, or that he killed her. Moscow, Idaho, 2010. For nearly 24 hours, police have been tailing Charles Capone, hoping to tie him to the disappearance of his estranged wife, Rachel Anderson. But as Capone and a friend walk out of a restaurant, it appears this cop has just been made.
Hey! You must think I'm an idiot. What, you think I'm some kind of mark that doesn't recognize Bush League surveillance?
Police quickly ID Capone's friend as David Stone, a local baseball coach and volunteer firefighter.
Mr. Stone, who worked for the city of Moscow, knew many of the Moscow police officers, spotted the surveillance. and they had a bit of an unpleasant confrontation.
That's my friend. You keep asking him about that night, I'm gonna tell you something.
He said, "Oh, by the way, I happened to be at Charles's shop Friday when Rachel was there."
In other words, Stone and Capone were together on April 16th, the last day anyone saw Rachel.
We've never heard of this before. Why on earth would Charles Capone not tell us if he had a person who's potentially an alibi witness?
As Rachel's family holds out hope of finding her alive, detectives question Stone on his whereabouts on April 16th. He claims that on that afternoon, he brought his Dodge Durango SUV to Capone's garage in Moscow.
Stone did go out to Charles's shop. They were going to work on one of the Stone family vehicles. Rachel did show up. She came and went during the course of the afternoon into the early evening.
Got hungry, went to A&W to eat. When I came back, Rachel was gone.
Stone wouldn't say that he actually saw her leave. He said, "I left to go get some food, came back, she was gone, never saw her again." They worked on the cars a little bit more.
I need a drink.
They took a break, and Mr. Stone dropped off Mr. Capone at a local bar. Stone, who's a recovering alcoholic, hadn't drunk in a number of years, went home briefly. Told his wife that he had dropped Charles at the bar and that they were still working on the car. Then went back to pick him up from the bar, and they finished working on the car, and that was it.
I'm telling you, I wish you a lot of luck in the investigation. Obviously, he had nothing to do with this. We'll be in touch.
Stone seems convincing, but can investigators corroborate his story?
We'll start with the A&W, work our way back.
He said he went to the A&W to get food. What happened when you checked that out?
We never saw him on the video cameras there.
The video from the bar doesn't show either one of them there at any time. And so the story started crumbling.
Stone's story starts to fall apart when the Yukon Rachel was driving is found near this convenience store and bus stop in Lewiston, Idaho, about 35 miles from Moscow. And Rachel's purse is inside.
Someone had set it up to look like she had maybe left on the bus, or hoped that maybe someone would steal the car because the keys were in it, the purse was in it in plain sight. All these pieces of evidence point down a certain road, and we began to feel that we had a homicide case.
I can't imagine the pain of this family as their hope starts to drift into the reality that they're no longer looking for Rachel, but only looking for her body.
Captain Alley, please.
When Capone's buddy Bert Bogdan hears his Yukon has been located, he realizes what he thought was a friendship was simply a means to an end.
I thought I had a good read on people, and that was true 99% of the time. But that 1%, Charles was in that 1%, and I put down my defenses and allowed him in to manipulate my point of view, to manipulate me.
Bert tells Capone to move out of his guest room and meets with police.
Mr. Bogdan, please, come in.
Then he provides authorities with a huge break in the case. He turns over a handgun he says he'd been holding for Capone since March, roughly a month before Rachel went missing.
I know you're frustrated. I know you're angry. You're upset.
He did bring some of the negative energy of what was going on between him and Rachel. He brought that home, and I asked him if he had a gun.
Why don't you let me hang on to that?
And I said, you know, if you have one, you need to give that to me, because nothing good's going to happen with you having a firearm.
We knew that he was a convicted felon. He wasn't allowed to possess any firearms. So that information was turned over to the federal authorities. And within a couple weeks of Rachel's disappearance, he was taken into custody on the federal charges.
It puts us in a position that he may decide it's now worth to come clean and tell us what happened.
Mr. Capone.
And I told Charles, I said, today, Charles, you're going to tell me that you murdered Rachel Anderson and where her body is.
You got one of those things right.
So he's admitting that he either knows where Rachel's body is, or that he killed her. Which one is it?
There were some negotiations to see if arrangements could be made, an agreement could be reached, where Mr. Capone, at a minimum, would tell us where Rachel was. Nothing ever came of it.
Capone pleads guilty to possession of a firearm and is sentenced to 33 months. Investigators then turn again to David Stone. When they tell him they know he lied about the events of April 16th, will Stone come clean?
We confront him point blank and say, you got blood on your hands, David.
And you know it.
Most people that are not guilty are going to tell us, I do not, you're crazy, you're wrong.
I need a glass of water.
The thing that was really significant during that conversation with David Stone is he never denied it. So we really had a pretty good feel at that time that David Stone was involved in this.
But police still don't have enough evidence to arrest him. As months pass without a break in the case, Rachel's family decides to work on Stone in their own way, plastering the street where he lives with missing posters of Rachel.
We had hung him up everywhere, all the way to his work, because we knew he worked for the city at the time, so all the way.
So you did that deliberately so that he would have to be reminded of your sister?
Yes.
So that perhaps he'd come forward?
Right. We thought that that would be the person that would help us.
But Stone doesn't come forward. Now, in September of 2012, more than 2 years since Rachel vanished, Capone is about to be released from prison. Authorities know they have to find some way to keep him behind bars.
We were pretty concerned about Charles getting out. We were concerned about him fleeing the country or killing somebody else. So Jackie's just going through the case again. She calls me up and says, I've got probable cause to arrest Charles Capone for domestic violence, second degree, which is a felony in Washington for the strangulation event that Rachel had reported. We had a witness that saw the red marks, so we developed probable cause. But we arrested him essentially as he was being let out of federal prison. He was brought back to Southern County. And that's really when he began to kind of run his mouth in jail.
If you want to get rid of somebody, don't strangle. Shoot, it makes blood splatter.
He told a cellmate that the cops thought he'd murdered his wife, but it was going to be okay because we'd never find the body.
There's one problem with committing the perfect crime, and that is that people can't help themselves but brag about it.
A team of us got together and we reviewed all the evidence, reviewed what we had, the statements we had, and determined that, yes, we had enough to charge Charles Capone and David Stone with principal murder. Aiding and abetting each other in the act. Either you did the act yourself or you aided the other in doing the act.
Finally, as the two old friends await trial, Capone gives Stone some advice. Advice that'll come back to haunt him.
The penal system's no place for a guy like you.
Charles Capone says to David Stone, you don't belong here. And I believe it was at that point where he's like, you're right.
3 long years after the disappearance of Rachel Anderson, are police about to learn what really happened?
I need to speak to my lawyer.
Coming up.
He said he had the look of the devil in his eye.
She wasn't even deceased when he first came upon this scene.
It's been 3 years since Rachel Anderson went missing. But finally, in 2013, David Stone is ready to talk about the role he and Charles Capone played in Rachel's disappearance.
It was a circumstantial case, up until David Stone came forward.
Listen, there's a lot I haven't told you.
On Friday, April 16, 2010, Rachel stopped by Capone's garage to pick up her car and inform him about a decision she'd made about their future.
She was going to tell Charles Capone that she was ending the relationship.
I've just gotten to the point where I don't think I can trust you anymore, and I cannot be with someone that I don't trust.
Rachel been in and out of the shop all afternoon. She was just about to be finished with the car.
He finishes it sometime in the evening, and Charles Capone tells David Stone to drive his vehicle into a shop. He gets his vehicle into his shop. While in there, he hears a loud sound. He walks out and sees Charles Capone strangling Rachel Anderson. And he said he had the look of the devil in his eye.
Was she alive at that point?
Her leg was moving.
She wasn't even deceased when he first came upon this scene.
So he watched the kill.
Basically.
You're in this with me.
What kind of a human being stands there and watches his friend strangle a woman to death?
What you did then?
I wanted to ditch her Yukon.
Charles told him, leave your cell phone here so it doesn't look like we left. So Charles was thinking of all these things. Charles told David to drive his truck, Charles's truck, and follow him. And Charles drove the Yukon.
Stone says they left the Yukon at the convenience store and bus stop in Lewiston, Idaho.
What happened after that? Charles got in the truck. We drove back to Moscow.
Stone claims Charles asked him to get some chains, so he stopped by the city maintenance shop where he worked. Back at Capone's garage, Stone says he and Capone used the chains to wrap Rachel's body in a tarp.
Then Charles used some rope and tied it all together. David referred to it in our interview with him as the package.
He calls Rachel's body a package? That's what she is? This is actual footage of David Stone leading police to the spot where he says they dumped Rachel's body, off the Red Wolf Bridge, which spans the Snake River between Washington and Idaho.
This is the area that back on April 16, 2010, that we disposed of a package that we had in the back of my Durango.
They drive across the bridge to see if anybody's there. They do a U-turn, go back. They stop, there's nobody around. They get out, throw her in.
In September 2014, with David Stone as the prosecution's star witness, Charles Capone goes on trial for the murder of his wife. He pleads not guilty and has changed the story police say he originally gave them, claiming he never stalked Rachel. It makes the prosecution's case even more difficult.
The anxiety is that we don't have a chance for a do-over. And so you have to present your case the best you can, because you won't have another chance.
I guess I was a little nervous, because I thought, oh Lord, if they don't have enough, then he's gonna walk.
Despite the assistance of dive teams and the U.S. Coast Guard, investigators had been unable to find Rachel's body in the Snake River. But at trial, it's as if the testimony of Rachel's children bring their mother back to life.
It tears me up a little bit even right now to think about her daughters and her family having to testify about who she was and her disappearing and them never having any closure from that. That was emotionally really powerful.
That's not what Capone seems to feel. To Rachel's family, he appears to take a perverse enjoyment in all of it.
He smirked at me when I was on stand. I just thought it was funny that I was sitting there crying about my mom.
He took pleasure in it.
Yes.
But even without Rachel's body, it takes the jury just 3.5 hours to find Charles Capone guilty of first-degree murder. Capone is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Rachel was dead. There was only one possible person who had the motive and the opportunity to kill her. That was Charles Capone.
In exchange for his testimony, David Stone is allowed to plead guilty to the lesser charge of failing to report Rachel's death to law enforcement. He is sentenced to 3 to 7 years. What do you make of that sentence that David Stone got? Only a few years, really.
Yeah, I think it's worth it for putting Charles away.
It's hard to walk past Charles Capone's old garage and imagine how Rachel lost her life here. Yet I'm encouraged by the family's dedication to prevent similar tragedies by warning women about the dangers of stalking.
People think stalking's a joke. I hear people joke about it all the time. Yeah, there's people stalking me. That's a hard word for me to hear because I've seen the pain of it.
It's a pain Rachel's loved ones will probably feel for the rest of their lives.
She's not just a story. She was so much more than that. She just had a zest. She was just like a huge bright light.
People forget that it's not just one person who's being victimized in a murder. It's children, it's grandchildren, it's generations.